Think your HOA is strict? Wait till you hear how one rule follower ended up with a wrongful death charge, all because a gate stayed shut during a 911 call. It started like any ordinary day in a quiet, picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. Rows of neatly trimmed hedges, manicured lawns that all looked eerily identical, and pastel-painted houses that seemed to copy one another as if cut from the same cookie-cutter design. To an outsider, it was the image of safety, the American dream in physical form. But underneath the fresh paint and white picket fences, there was tension, control, and a constant fear of stepping out of line. The HOA president, a man named Richard Mallory, was not the kind of person you'd call warm or approachable. He was a retired accountant who thrived on order, on spreadsheets, on rules that were written in black ink and never to be broken. To him, rules weren't just guidelines, they were the backbone of civilization. Without rules, chaos would reign, and Richard wasn't about to let chaos enter his perfectly ordered community. Neighbors tolerated him because he wasn't outwardly hostile. He never yelled, he never swore. Instead, he ruled with a cold, bureaucratic fist, citing page numbers and bylaw clauses like a priest reciting scripture. He fined families for leaving bicycles on driveways. He issued warnings over garden gnomes that weren't aesthetically compliant. He once wrote a 2-page letter to a resident demanding they repaint their mailbox because the shade of black was not the exact hue specified by the HOA handbook. Most rolled their eyes and paid their fines. After all, that was the price of living behind the shiny gates. But then came the day when Richard's devotion to the rules collided with something much larger than parking violations or holiday lights. It collided with life and death. It was a muggy summer afternoon when the emergency call came in. Inside one of the homes, a man named Daniel Perez had collapsed suddenly in his living room. Daniel was only 44 years old, a father of 2 young children with no history of serious illness. His wife, frantic and barely able to keep her voice steady, dialed 911 as her children cried in the background. The dispatcher, calm but urgent, assured her that help was on the way. Paramedics were already rolling, sirens blaring, cutting through the afternoon heat. But when they arrived at the community, they found themselves at the gate. This gate was not the kind you could simply push open. It was a thick, electronically controlled steel barrier designed less for aesthetics and more for exclusion. It only opened for residents with proper authorization. No card, no code, no entry. The paramedics pulled up, lights flashing, and tried to buzz in. Nothing happened. They tried again. Still locked. Inside, every second was critical. Daniel was gasping for breath, his wife on the phone screaming that he wasn't responding. The dispatcher relayed the urgency to the paramedics, who in turn related to the HOA's on-call contact, and the person who answered was Richard Mallory. The conversation was short, sharp, and chilling in hindsight. The medics pleaded for access. Richard calmly asked for proof. They explained it was an emergency. He repeated that no one enters without proper clearance. "Rules are rules," he said flatly. What Richard didn't know, or maybe what he did know and simply didn't care to weigh heavily enough, was that Daniel's life was draining away in real time. The dispatcher begged. The paramedics offered codes, identification, even to patch the HOA line into the 911 system to verify authenticity. Richard refused. 20 minutes ticked by. The medics eventually rammed the gate and forced their way in. By the time they reached Daniel, he was gone. The neighborhood reeled in shock. Word spread quickly that Daniel had died because help couldn't get through. His children's cries echoed long after the sirens stopped. Neighbors whispered at barbecues and leaned over fences with hushed outrage. Could it really be true that their president had blocked life-saving help in the name of rules? At first, some defended him. They said, well, rules exist for a reason. What if it had been a scam? What if criminals pretended to be paramedics? That line of reasoning gave Richard a brief cushion of sympathy, but it didn't last. The reality was too brutal. A man was dead, and the gate had been the barrier between survival and tragedy. It didn't take long for authorities to investigate. The local prosecutor took a keen interest in the case, and soon Richard found himself not just vilified by neighbors, but facing actual criminal charges: wrongful death, negligence. Prosecutors painted him not as a misunderstood bureaucrat, but as a cold enforcer who placed his love of power over basic human decency. The trial drew national attention. News outlets framed it as a cautionary tale about HOAs gone too far, about suburban dystopias hiding in plain sight. They showed images of Daniel's widow clutching tissues, describing how she had to watch her husband die as help sat trapped outside. They contrasted that with Richard's emotionless demeanor in court, his stiff posture, his insistence that he had simply followed protocol. But here's the thing. Richard wasn't entirely right in his own logic. That's what made the case so unsettling. He wasn't drunk driving. He wasn't waving a gun around. He was doing what he had been elected to do: enforce rules. And that was precisely the prosecution's point. Blind obedience, they argued, is not virtue. It is cowardice. They showed how early HOAs had been built on exclusion, on the idea that gates and barriers and rules were more important than people. This case, they argued, was simply the logical endpoint of that mindset. A mindset where a dying man's life was secondary to a bylaw printed in a binder. Neighbors testified about Richard's obsession with control. One elderly woman recalled how Richard once threatened to fine her for keeping a wind chime on her porch. Another described how he patrolled the streets with a clipboard, noting down violations. None of these stories were criminal in themselves, but together they painted a portrait of a man who valued rules above relationships, regulations over humanity. The defense tried to argue that Richard had been unfairly vilified, that he had acted out of caution, that the system itself was to blame for not giving clear emergency override procedures. But the jury wasn't swayed. In their eyes, Richard had become a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked authority. As the verdict was read, Richard barely blinked. Guilty. Wrongful death. He would face years in prison. The community was left shaken. Some said justice was served. Others worried about what it meant for their property values, as if, even in the wake of tragedy, money was still the HOA's sacred cow. And somewhere in the silence, the ghost of Daniel Perez lingered, not just in the home where his children still played, but in the lesson etched forever into the neighborhood's history. Rules had killed him, or rather the person who worshipped those rules had. And here's the darker twist. Richard wasn't unique. Across the country, HOAs operate with alarming power, often unchecked, often answerable only to themselves. They can foreclose on homes, dictate paint colors, and yes, control access to life-saving services. The line between order and tyranny is thinner than anyone wants to admit. So when you get that notice about your grass being too long or your car being parked an inch over the line, laugh if you want, roll your eyes. But remember this story. Remember Daniel. Remember the gate. Because sometimes the difference between a minor annoyance and a devastating tragedy is just one person who decides that rules are rules. And when humanity is sacrificed on that altar, the cost isn't just fines or fees, it's lives. The trial didn't end with the verdict. If anything, it only deepened the divide within the community. Some residents who had once feared Richard now whispered that maybe he was being made into a scapegoat. Others argued that nothing less than prison could restore balance, that Daniel's death would otherwise be swept under the rug as unfortunate but unavoidable. Daniel's widow, Marisol, became the face of the tragedy. She was not someone who had ever sought the spotlight. She was a soft-spoken elementary school teacher who preferred the company of her students to news cameras. But grief has a way of transforming people, sharpening their voices into weapons. At every press conference, she held up a framed photo of her husband smiling with their children and asked the same piercing question: How could a rule matter more than a life? That phrase caught fire. It appeared on protest signs, in editorials, on social media feeds. Life over rules became a rallying cry for those who felt HOAs had grown into petty tyrannies. Across the country, horror stories surfaced. Paramedics delayed by gates, fire trucks blocked by poorly placed bollards. Homeowners sued for trivialities while emergencies went ignored. The pressure reached state legislators who proposed bills requiring HOAs to install universal emergency override systems on gates. The hearings were packed with families who shared their own near misses. Grandmothers waiting for ambulances while gate codes failed. Houses burning while fire engines idled outside. Daniel's story gave them a banner to gather beneath, and Marisol, once hesitant, found herself testifying with a trembling but determined voice. Meanwhile, Richard sat in a county jail awaiting sentencing. For a man who had lived his life by routines and control, incarceration was a particular kind of hell. The clamor of voices he couldn't shush, the unpredictability of cellmates who didn't care about bylaws or order, the gnawing realization that he was no longer the enforcer, but the punished. It unraveled him slowly. Guards described him as quiet, almost eerily so, scribbling notes on scraps of paper as though he was drafting new rules for a world that no longer listened. What unsettled observers most was his lack of visible remorse. When asked in interviews if he regretted what happened, he would answer in abstractions. "I regret that the system failed," he said once, staring at the table. "I regret that there weren't clearer procedures. I regret that people don't understand the importance of structure." But he never once said the words Marisol and her children longed to hear. "I regret what I did." His lawyer appealed to the court for leniency, arguing that Richard was a man trapped by the rigidity of the system he was given, not a monster. If the HOA had installed an override, this would never have happened. Are we to imprison a man for following the rules he was tasked with upholding? But the counterpoint was always the same. Humanity must come before procedure. If Richard had simply chosen compassion over compliance, Daniel would be alive. That was the unshakable truth that no technicalities could erase. The sentencing hearing was one of the most watched in county history. Neighbors filed into the courthouse, reporters filled every seat, and Marisol sat in the front row clutching her children's hands. Richard, thin and pale after months behind bars, stood before the judge. The courtroom hushed. "Mr. Mallory," the judge began, "you have been convicted of wrongful death. This case is unprecedented, and it has shaken the public's trust in the systems meant to protect them. But more than that, it has shown the consequences of elevating policy above people." The judge's voice grew heavy. "You had a choice, and you chose wrong." Richard was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some thought it too harsh, others too lenient. Marisol wept quietly, her children clinging to her arms. Richard showed no reaction, only adjusting his glasses and nodding once, as though the ruling itself was just another item to record in his mental ledger. Afterward, the neighborhood was never the same. The gates, once symbols of prestige, became symbols of entrapment. Families who had once boasted about their secure community now avoided mentioning where they lived. For sale signs appeared on manicured lawns, their neat rows disrupted by the churn of unease. New buyers were scarce, who wanted to live in the place where a man had died waiting for help. And yet, beneath the shame and the headlines, life continued. Children still rode their bikes on cul-de-sacs, barbecues still smoked on summer weekends. But every siren that echoed in the distance sent a ripple of dread through the residents. Would it happen again? Would the gates open this time? Marisol tried to rebuild. She moved her family out of the neighborhood within months, unwilling to raise her children where her father had died. She became an advocate for emergency access reform, speaking at conferences and community meetings across the state. People described her as gentle but unyielding, a voice that carried the weight of grief without bitterness. She refused to let Daniel be forgotten. Richard's story, however, faded into a different kind of memory. Some painted him as a cautionary tale, the man who worshipped rules until they destroyed him. Others, oddly enough, framed him as a martyr of principle, someone who had been punished not for cruelty, but for refusing to bend. In prison, he was said to lecture fellow inmates on the necessity of order, drawing crude charts on the walls of his cell. But outside, his name became shorthand for everything wrong with power without accountability. Years later, when documentaries revisited the tragedy, one neighbor summed it up in a single line. "We built a wall to keep danger out. Turns out, the danger was already inside." And that's the truth lurking in every gated community, every HOA meeting where neighbors argue over the height of a hedge or the color of a door. On the surface, it's about order. Beneath it, it's about control. And when control matters more than compassion, when rules matter more than lives, then it's not safety you've built, it's a prison. The HOA board met only once after the sentencing before it collapsed under its own weight. The meeting was tense, held in the same sterile clubhouse where neighbors had once debated Christmas lights and lawn ornaments. This time, the air was different. No one joked, no one made small talk. They sat in stiff chairs like defendants awaiting their turn. The president of the board, a real estate agent named Cynthia, opened with a brittle voice. "We need to discuss how the association moves forward." But before she could continue, a neighbor cut her off. "Moves forward? Daniel is dead. Richard is in prison. What credibility do we even have?" Voices rose, sharp and bitter. Some demanded immediate resignation of the board. Others argued for dissolving the HOA altogether. A few tried to defend the concept, insisting that without rules, the community would fall into chaos, that property values would plummet, that outsiders would invade their quiet streets. But the words sounded hollow in the shadow of tragedy. One man stood and pointed to the door. "That gate killed him. Not Richard, not the rules, that gate. And we paid for it." His voice cracked. "We paid to trap our neighbor." The room erupted. Shouts overlapped. Someone pounded the table. Others stormed out. By the end of the night, the HOA board effectively ceased to exist. Members resigned en masse, leaving behind a neighborhood adrift. Without leadership, contracts lapsed. The landscaping company stopped coming. The pool went unmaintained. The once pristine community began to fray at the edges, the facade of perfection crumbling. Reporters descended like vultures. Drone footage of the decaying lawns and discolored pool became a metaphor played on endless news loops. The glamorous gated community rotting from within. Every story framed it the same way, a symbol of misplaced priorities, a cautionary tale for suburbia. Children who had once proudly told classmates where they lived now avoided mentioning it. Teens scrawled graffiti on the abandoned clubhouse, phrases like "rules kill" and "free Daniel." Some nights, strangers drove by just to gawk, pointing at the gate like tourists at a monument of shame. For Marisol, watching from afar, it was surreal. This was the place she and Daniel had chosen to raise their children, believing it safe, believing it orderly. Now it stood as a monument to his death. She refused to drive past it. Even when her advocacy work brought her nearby, she asked friends to take the long route around. Yet the story did not end there. Years stretched on, and the tragedy sparked deeper changes. States across the country began to pass laws requiring emergency responders to have universal gate access. Advocacy groups formed to challenge the unchecked powers of HOAs. Daniel's story was cited in hearings from California to Florida, invoked in debates about whether these private governments had grown too powerful, too detached from basic human compassion. Marisol became a reluctant figurehead. She never sought fame, but she carried Daniel's memory like a torch, and people gathered to its light. She spoke not with fire and fury, but with calm persistence, which made her all the harder to dismiss. Legislators listened because she never screamed, she simply told the truth, over and over, until it could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, Richard served his sentence. The prison hardened him, but not in the way most imagined. He didn't join gangs or seek protection. Instead, he carved out a strange niche as the warden of rules. Other inmates mocked him at first, calling him Mr. HOA, but some grew oddly fascinated. In a place where chaos reigned, where violence erupted unpredictably, Richard's obsession with order provided a peculiar anchor. He created schedules for cleaning cells, drafted makeshift bylaws for his unit, and even mediated disputes with the patience of a man who believed process could fix anything. Guards observed this with a mix of amusement and unease. Some said he was delusional, clinging to control in a place designed to strip it away. Others argued he was adapting, bending his compulsion into something useful. Either way, he never spoke publicly about Daniel, not once. When parole hearings eventually came, Richard maintained the same refrain. He regretted how the system failed. He regretted the lack of clarity in emergency protocols. But never Daniel, never Marisol, never the children. And so parole was denied, again and again. Outside, the neighborhood fractured beyond repair. The HOA never reformed. Eventually, the gates were dismantled altogether, left rusting in a county scrapyard. Without strict enforcement, some residents embraced freedom, painting their houses bold colors, planting wild gardens. Others moved away, unwilling to live without the promise of order. Property values dipped, then stabilized, attracting a new kind of resident, people who valued independence over uniformity, community over conformity. In its ruin, the neighborhood transformed into something more authentic, less polished, more alive. Years later, a documentary filmmaker interviewed former residents, piecing together the legacy. Some still defended Richard, claiming he was unfairly vilified. Others spat his name like a curse. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. Daniel's death had revealed the truth about gated communities. Safety was never guaranteed by walls or rules. Safety lived in compassion, in neighbors willing to see each other as human before anything else. In the final cut of the documentary, Marisol's words closed the film. She sat in her modest living room, surrounded by photos of her children now grown, and spoke with quiet strength. "We thought gates would protect us. We thought rules would keep us safe. But none of that mattered. What matters is people choosing to care for each other. That's the only protection any of us will ever have." The screen faded to black, and with it, the story that started with a gate ended not with vengeance, not with policy, but with a simple truth spoken softly by a widow who refused to let her husband's death be meaningless.